Hello, and welcome back to Podfinder. This is Day 11 of the 12 Days of Sinmas. And if you don't know what that means, pause this video and check out the playlist I've linked in the description. The Prelude video explains everything. Today, I am looking at the mightiest of the Runelords, Xanderghul, the Master of Illusions, the Satrap of Cyrusian, and the Champion of the Sin of Pride. Xanderghul is one of only two Runelords who maintained his grip on power throughout all of Thassilon's history, and he employed a wide variety of methods to achieve this feat. He maintained a close connection to the faith of the Peacock Spirit, one of the dominant religions in Thassilon, and this connection granted him tremendous political power. For that reason, I'll also be discussing the faith of the Peacock Spirit in this video, as well as the various orders of warriors and scholars devoted to it. Before that, though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. And, before I forget, check out the timeline I put together of Thassilon's history. If you're a visual person, it will really help you get a hold of the history of Xin and the Runelords who would take over his empire. Link in the description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's dig in. The sin of pride is a corruption of the virtue of humility, and is associated with the school of illusion. Upon casting an illusion spell, spellcasters practicing rune magic would be overcome with an innate awareness of their own gifts and talents. This was vaguely similar to the sense of weakness experienced by casters of abjuration spells, but in the opposite direction. Illusionists who practiced the virtue of humility would interpret this surge in awareness as a reminder not only of their strengths, but also the innate strengths of others, and would also use the feeling to derive a greater understanding of their own weaknesses. Those who followed the teachings of pride, however, took this feeling as a sign that they were superior to those around them, driving them to behave as though all the world should revolve around them and their whims. The School of Illusion. The School of Illusion is one which is still heavily debated by runic scholars on Golarion today. Illusion spells encompass all manner of spells which alter the nature of reality, or at least alter the way reality is perceived. And therein lies the matter of debate. For who can say if an illusion spell is altering the physical world, like transmutation or conjuration, or if it merely alters the minds of its subjects, like an enchantment. So they merely perceive reality in a new way. Interestingly, different spells within the school seem to create their effects in different ways. Some spells, often referred to as figments and glamours, appear to alter the measurable properties of reality, at least for the duration of the spell. These spells create effects which multiple targets, everyone who can view or otherwise experience the effect, can witness and interact with. These spells might include the creation of large effects like non-existent buildings or monstrous figures of the caster's design. They might also include invisibility spells, or effects like illusory disguise. These are spells which have effects intended not for a single target, but for anyone who sees them, and appear to create one or more measurable changes upon the world. They produce physical changes, light, color, texture, scent, which can be objectively observed. Other spells within the illusion school appear to directly alter the minds of specific targets. Some of these spells, called phantasms, create similar illusions to those discussed previously, objects or creatures of the spellcaster's design. The difference is that these are only witnessed by the target and the caster, not by any bystanders. Phantasms might also be rudimentary or unfinished illusions which require the target's mind to fill in the details, like a pool of darkness which fills with the target creature's greatest fears. The other type of spells, which seem to impact only the mind of the intended target, are the patterns, spells which create symbols, patterns, or hypnotic effects which only the target can see, and which typically induce docility or fascination in the target. And then there are the shadow spells. These tend to draw their power from the shadow plane, now called the Netherworld, and create illusions which seek to cause real, tangible effects upon the world. These spells only create large impacts on the world if they manage to trick the target into believing they are real. And while that statement is true of nearly all spells of the illusion school, shadow spells trade increased versatility for a higher chance of being detected as fake. If the illusion is unconvincing, the realization of the nature of the illusion on the part of the target is often enough to render the spell in question partially or even entirely ineffective. As a fun little side note, back in PF1E, the Shadow Mystery Oracle was absolutely busted in its power and versatility, as it was a spontaneous caster who could have access to nearly 3 whole schools of magic at any given time. Bring it back, Paizo. I don't care if it was horribly unbalanced. It was rad as hell. The greatest strength of illusion as a school is its apparent versatility, since the wielder's imagination is the school's greatest limitation. The effects which an illusionist can create are incredibly varied, though often require significant subtlety and cleverness to use effectively. The school does come with its limitations, however. Targets who are mindless, like constructs or certain types of undead, are immune to the mind-affecting effects of some illusion spells. Other foes might have sensory abilities which bypass visual or auditory illusions, rendering them useless. Finally, situations which require drastic physical solutions, like extreme weather events, physical barriers which need to be passed, or the need to create material resources, cannot be solved by merely creating illusory effects. These weaknesses are in part amplified by illusion's opposition schools. In Thassilonian runic practice, illusionists were forbidden from casting spells of the transmutation or conjuration schools. This prevented them in many ways from creating physical changes in the world, either by conjuring matter and physical servants, or by physically altering the world around them. This forced them to rely even more on the false constructions of their own design, which, in turn, rendered them even more vulnerable to situations where illusions were poor solutions. Interestingly, the lack of conjuration spells also prevented illusionists from teleporting around Thassilon, which left the Runelord of Pride in a difficult spot geopolitically. Of course, Xanderghul wasn't content to simply let this failing lie, and so took great care to devise a solution, which I will discuss in detail later. I haven't found any publications from Paizo explaining how the Rune of Illusion magic was interpreted from a visual standpoint. If I had to guess what it could represent, I would suggest it might look a bit like the top of a staff or scepter, perhaps indicative of the rulership to which the practitioners of Pride thought themselves entitled. Really, though, I don't think this rune looks like much of anything. Xanderghul, the Runelord of Pride. The first and only Runelord of Pride was Xanderghul, who took up the position in -6480 AR and ruled for 1,187 years until the Earthfall calamity in -5293. Xanderghul began his career as one of the apprentices of Xin, and it was his influence, in conjunction with that of Cyrusian, which ultimately convinced Xin to appoint the 7 mightiest apprentices to the position of Runelord. The lore heavily implies that Xanderghul was born into an elite noble Aslanti family, based upon his physical features and a claim of nobility he would make very late into his story. That said, hard information on his familial origins doesn't really exist. Regardless of his origins, Xanderghul was a once, or I guess twice in a generation talent. His skill with illusion magic was entirely unsurpassed, and his political acumen was nearly unmatched. Interestingly, despite his natural talents, Xanderghul was not the most powerful of Xin's apprentices at the time of the naming of the Runelords. He was at least second to Alderpash, the first Runelord of Wrath, though this would not remain the case for long. Even without being the most powerful of the apprentices, Xanderghul, alongside Cyrusian, held a high degree of influence over the group, and appears to have been viewed as a leader among them. As the first Runelord of Pride, or Humility, at the time, Xanderghul was the recipient of the Flawless Hammer, a Lucerne hammer of deceptive design and construction. The weapon appeared, at first glance, to be a fairly plain and unadorned hammer made of simple iron, which contrasted heavily with Xanderghul's generally ostentatious and over-the-top appearance. But this unremarkable appearance was merely a facade. In truth, the flawless hammer was constructed from sky metal, but not one of the 7 known sky metals. No, for this weapon, Xin appears to have chosen the only known sample of an 8th and otherwise unknown sky metal. This metal took on the visual characteristics of iron, but imbued the weapon with several bizarre traits. It could cut through illusory defenses with ease, apparently going so far as to ignore any mischance induced by an illusion-based effect, including things like mirror image. Additionally, the weapon has been described thusly, quote, "The hammer's damage always hit at its peak potential," unquote. I interpret this to mean that the wielder never rolled their weapon damage dice, and instead always rolled max damage. Based on an incomplete stat block, we also know that the flawless hammer possessed both the axiomatic and spell-storing property runes. Given how powerful Xanderghul was, I assume his Alarakin must have been a +5 weapon in 1E, or a +3 major striking weapon in 2E, but of course I can't prove that. Also, I should mention that the Lucerne hammer hasn't been ported over to 2E yet, but the Dwarven Longhammer or the Bec de Corbin are probably pretty good stand-ins for the time being. While all the weapons of Rule possessed minds of their own, the Flawless Hammer was unique in that its consciousness was an exact duplicate of Xanderghul's own. I don't know if this was always the case, or if Xanderghul managed to somehow replace the original mind within the weapon after he received it. As a bit of a side note, I find it fascinating that Xin, whose fascination with sky metal bordered on obsession, apparently used the only known sample of a mysterious 8th metal to forge a weapon which he intended to simply give away. I would have expected him to have kept such a rare treasure for himself. That said, Xin saw the existence of 7 sky metals, which corresponded to 7 virtues and 7 schools of magic, as a sign of the truth of his philosophy surrounding rune magic. So perhaps he simply sought to rid himself of an inconvenient piece of evidence which contradicted his assertions. After his appointment to the position of Runelord, Xanderghul took up the rulership of Cyrusian, the northernmost of the 7 Thassilonian member states. While each of the kingdoms of Thassilon had its points of distinction, none could compete with Cyrusian for sheer grandeur, scale, wealth, or prestige. Cyrusian was the largest and most populous of the Thassilonian kingdoms, stretching from the modern lands of the Lenorm kings in the north all the way to the Cyphergate and the Storval Rise in the south. It stretched from a shared border with Xin Edasaril in the west all the way to the mountains containing the Storval Deep in the east. Cyrusian played host to at least 4 major cities, all of which were densely populated, making it a cultural hub for the empire. While relatively little has been detailed of Cyrusian's economic structure, I strongly suspect it had a balanced economy, with equal portions of resource extraction, agriculture, commodity refinement, and merchant trade. I believe this to be true based on the immense scale of the kingdom, as well as the balance of terrain and environment types within the kingdom, including forests, mountains, hills, plains, and rivers. The nation also maintained a small degree of ocean access, though not to the same degree as Eurythnia or Edasaril. While the specifics of Cyrusian's economy are not known, the results certainly are. Cyrusian was an incredibly wealthy nation, and Xanderghul channeled this wealth into the development of a glorious kingdom, which he thought reflected his own magnificence. Cyrusian possessed more grand monuments than any other Thassilonian kingdom, and these were dedicated, almost universally, to the greatness of Xanderghul himself. 4 major civic centers could be found in Cyrusian. The one of these about which we know the least is Corvales, a city located here, which was built on either side of a major river, and was therefore likely a trading city. Corvales has been entirely lost to history since the Earthfall calamity, and no trace of it has yet been found in the Age of Lost Omens. A bit more information has been discovered about Torande, located here. The ruins of this city formed the basis for the modern city of Yol in the lands of the Lenorm kings. Torande appears to have been constructed at least partially underground, given that modern construction in Yol commonly uncovers large underground caverns filled with ancient arcane experiments. A third city, pronounced either Justnok or Justnok, laid to the northwest, though this one too has been largely lost to time. Though its location is known in the Age of Lost Omens, it now exists beneath the waves of the steaming sea. All three of these cities were marvels to behold, as beyond their grand construction, all of them were draped in illusions of all kinds. Xanderghul made frequent use of permanent illusions throughout his kingdom. These served myriad purposes, from covering up flaws or otherwise improving a location's appearance, to entertaining the populace at large, to even providing defense for a city. Illusions were commonplace all throughout Cyrusian, and were taken as a given by even the poorest and least well-off of the citizens of the nation. Of course, as grand as these three cities doubtlessly were, all three paled in comparison to Xanderghul's chosen capital, Zin Cyrusian. This city was located within the Kodor Mountains, which provided all who dwelled within a stout natural defense, as well as a series of breathtaking views. The mountains also provided Xanderghul with a canvas for the first of his great works of self-indulgence. It was Xanderghul who began the long and famous tradition among the Runelords of carving their faces into mountainsides. Not long after selecting his capital, Xanderghul's handsome but imperious visage stared down magnanimously at his citizens. Unfortunately, because Zin Cyrusian has yet to be rediscovered in the Age of Lost Omens, we don't actually know that much about how the city was laid out. We know that Xanderghul certainly used his most extravagant and fabulous illusions here, and that the city was guarded by entire legions of enslaved angels, giants, and dragons, but we don't have much beyond that. Xanderghul ruled his capital from the Peacock Throne, within his fortress, Citadel Arit. Though even details on this palace are difficult to come by. Sources on Golarion are undecided whether it was a floating castle or a tower of impossible height. Personally, I suspect it was the latter, since Xanderghul will create a floating castle later in his career, and I feel like he was the type of guy who wouldn't pursue the same idea twice. While I'm still discussing Cyrusian more broadly, I should point out that it was Cyrusian which played host to the Emerald Chambers of Zin, which I discussed all the way back on Day 3. Cyrusian might have been chosen due to its central-ish location, but Xanderghul also did everything he could to make his kingdom the unofficial head of the nation, a series of efforts which I'll discuss a bit later on in this video. But who was Xanderghul? Who was this man who would become the undisputed and unchallenged strongest member of the Runelords? If you'll permit me a bit of candor, Xanderghul was a narcissistic bastard. He saw himself as the greatest, mightiest, and smartest man to ever live, and saw everything and everyone in his domain as a mere accessory to his own greatness. In a bid to capture his own glory, Xanderghul gave himself many titles over the years, including the Satrap of Cyrusian, the Lord of Illusion, and the Master of the Unblinking Eye, which, to be frank, sounds more like it should apply to a specialist in divination, not illusion. These were far from his only titles, however, and, as he grew in power, he actively sought further positions of prestige. After Zin's death, for instance, Xanderghul insisted that he was the true heir of the first king, and the rightful emperor of Thassilon. At one point, he even attempted to claim the crown of Aslant, but I'll get to that a bit later on. To further illustrate my point, Xanderghul dedicated an outrageous number of monuments to himself and his own achievements. Images of his, admittedly handsome, face dotted the empire. The only figure to which he appeared to devote greater reverence was his beloved deity, the Peacock Spirit. More on that in a few minutes. Xanderghul's obsession with himself went so deep that even in his most private sanctum, a place where no other living soul would ever go, he commissioned the creation of specialized golems, which were lovingly carved in his own likeness, not to mention an enormous painting depicting him in all his glory, seated upon a throne. This was a man who really had bought into his own bullshit, and, unfortunately, had the power and wealth to force everyone else to go along with his delusions. And, even more unfortunately, this is where I must concede that Xanderghul actually could back up many of his claims of superiority. He espoused a personal philosophy in line with the teachings of the Peacock Spirit, which drove him to master what he deemed the three aspects of himself: mind, body, and spirit. Xanderghul was an accomplished scholar and mage, demonstrating his mastery of the mind. He was strikingly handsome, and took exceptional care of his physique, holding himself to high physical standards, despite his status as a wizard. And his spirit, the strength of his soul, was nothing short of incredible, though I won't be demonstrating how I know that for a few more minutes. Xanderghul appeared as a tall, handsome man with a severe bearing. His physique and facial features spoke to his lineage, as he demonstrated all the classical ideal characteristics of an ancient Aslanti leader: a pronounced widow's peak, dark hair, sharp eyebrows, and tan skin. As might be expected of a Runelord of Pride, he maintained an immaculate appearance, with a neatly trimmed beard and outfits which were, frankly, unbelievably cool. He is most commonly depicted in an armored skirt with matching greaves and bracers. A rich green cloak flowed from a set of steel pauldrons mounted to his gorget. All these pieces were intricately decorated, but the centerpiece of the look was almost certainly the peacock plumage, which sprouted magnificently from his collar, surrounding his head with an aura of color. In addition to the flawless hammer, which he always carried, Xanderghul was known to carry a staff, or scepter, decorated with feathers, and made from a wood called lignum vitae, a detail which I believe is a literary reference to the wizard Merlin, whose wand is said to be made from the same material. In short, Xanderghul looked absolutely amazing. I realize this is a lot of description about his appearance, but honestly, that seems appropriate for the Runelord of Pride. Xanderghul's appearance was a carefully crafted and maintained construction, as much a projection of the man's ideals as a representation of the man underneath the surface. It's important to remember that Xanderghul took the manipulation of the perception of others as a matter of course. He employed illusions with a degree of regularity which I doubt anyone outside of Sivana herself ever matched in Galarian's history. So, I see no evidence that the depictions we've seen in Paizo's official artwork is anything more than a mask, a construction intended to fool everyone, players and characters included, into seeing Xanderghul the way he would want to be seen. Though Xanderghul was hailed as a master diplomat throughout all of Thassilon, he was an impossibly demanding person, and expected nothing short of supplication on the part of those with whom he interacted. He expected constant praise and deference from those whom he deemed beneath him, which was basically everyone, and wasn't afraid to act out violently to enforce these expectations upon any who entered his presence. All that being said, my evidence for this comes from a single passage in Return of the Runelords, and that passage certainly isn't depicting Xanderghul under normal circumstances. It is possible that he held his arrogance in check more effectively during the majority of the Thassilonian period, but frankly, I find that unlikely. Much to my disappointment, Paizo has never produced a full stat block for Xanderghul at his full power. At least, not yet. More on that at the end of the video. That being said, Xanderghul's power was unmatched among the Runelords. That much is an undeniable fact. While he started out as merely a high-level wizard, he quickly proved his exceptional power and cleverness. This latent power is demonstrated first in -6466, when he ascended to mythic status. Xanderghul was the first of the Runelords to achieve this impressive feat, though he was followed only 13 years later by Cyrusian. What Xanderghul did to accomplish this mythic ascension is unclear. Regardless, this ascension was part of a broader power escalation between Xanderghul and the other Runelords, especially Cyrusian, whom he deemed a rival. Not long before this ascension, Cyrusian had discovered a powerful artifact called the Everdawn Pool, and I suspect this discovery might have motivated Xanderghul to push himself to new heights. This magical arms race between Xanderghul and Cyrusian would continue for centuries, with Cyrusian ascending to Mythic, then forging the first Runewell, only for Xanderghul to follow her up by revealing a brand new deity to Golarion and establishing a corresponding religion. This deity was the Peacock Spirit, a god of mysterious origins which Xanderghul himself claimed to have personally discovered in -6448. The Faith of the Peacock Spirit. The Peacock Spirit was, according to its own teachings, a manifestation of the concept of self-confidence. It concerned itself with the three aspects I mentioned earlier, the body, mind, and spirit, though it was also explicitly concerned with the art of rulership, and sought to attract followers interested in positions of power and leadership. As its symbol, the Peacock Spirit took up a peacock feather with a representation of an eye at its center, and it treated the Lucerne hammer as its favorite weapon. It had the domains of evil, law, and trickery in 1e, though confidence, trickery, and tyranny are likely the best analogues in 2e. Frustratingly, I haven't been able to find any listed edicts or anathema for the Peacock Spirit. After Xanderghul introduced the Faith of the Peacock Spirit to the people of Cyrusian, the religion took root, then spread like wildfire across all of Thassilon. The emphasis on self-perfection appealed to ascetics, knights, and monks, while scholars or mages, and especially illusionists, felt drawn to the mind aspect of the deity's teachings. The faith of the Peacock Spirit quickly found popularity in all the member states of Thassilon, with the peoples of Haruka finding it especially alluring. That said, Cyrusian, as the place where the faith was founded, would always be the nation which served as the heart of the new religion. The Church of the Peacock Spirit has been regularly referred to as a cult by the writers at Paizo. I'll be using that language from here on out, though I do feel that the term cult, especially as it is used in modern American English, implies a degree of underground status which didn't really apply to a faith as popular as the Peacock Spirits. That said, the cult was also a highly secretive organization, and prided itself on its esoteric rituals and its careful management and control of information. One method which the cult used to control the spread of information was the division of religious responsibilities within its ranks. Common followers and practitioners of the faith could simply join the cult with relative ease, but for the truly devout and the truly exceptional, further paths existed. Two orders, the Thoracic Order and the Order of the Green Feather, existed within the cult, focused respectively on the mental and martial aspects of the faith. The Thoracic Order focused on scholarship, research, and the preservation of knowledge. The Order of the Green Feather, meanwhile, focused on defending the faithful, and members were commonly employed as guards at sites of religious significance. Interestingly, different sources claim that Xanderghul either founded both orders or was the chief patron of both. Regardless of the truth of the matter, he was doubtlessly heavily involved in their foundation and management. Of the two orders, the Thoracic Order is the one about which we have substantially more information. To accomplish its stated mission of furthering magical and academic research throughout Thassilon, the members of the Thoracic Order founded numerous libraries and research facilities throughout the Empire. While the most famous of these, at least from the perspective of a player or GM, was located near the Cyrusian-Shalast border, multiple facilities were scattered all over Thassilon. This particular facility, called the Thoracic Monastery, was staffed by dozens, perhaps hundreds, of members of the Order, and the facility was likely defended by the Order of the Green Feather. Monks at the Thoracic Monastery spent their days in careful study in the lecture hall, or honing their combat skills in the training ground. They also copied or collected texts from a wide variety of sources from across the empire, leading to the development of a truly exceptional cache of knowledge stored in their subterranean library. To defend this collection of written works, the Thoracic monks constructed several powerful clockwork assassins, though they also constructed at least one clockwork servant to staff the library and aid in the locating of specific texts or volumes. One example of these treasured texts was the Anathema Archive, a powerful artifact consisting of a collection of 9 heavy scrolls of wyvern hide. The scrolls displayed all manner of swirling and shifting runes, with the pattern on the runes aligning to the user's state of mind and present circumstances. The Anathema Archive could be used as a magic scroll to cast any spell the caster knew, though forcing the scroll to display a specific desired spell required the caster to decipher the runes in a specific way, represented by an Arcana check. The artifact could also be used to perform research, as it was imbued with a bizarre and apparently comprehensive collection of knowledge of all things sinister, vile, and nightmarish. Performing this research required no additional skill check on the part of the user, but did force the user to pass a will save, or become confused and mentally drained as the wicked magics of the artifact invaded their mind. Interestingly, the Thoracic monks at the monastery, and apparently all throughout the empire, were not required to be exclusively devoted to Xanderghul, despite his patronage of the organization. The monks of the Thoracic Order could, and did, work directly with the other Runelords of Thassilon from time to time. As an example, the monks of the Thoracic Monastery were tasked by Karzug with the creation of a rune-slave cauldron, so he might match Zutha's ability to reliably resurrect deceased giant servants. By comparison to the Thoracic Order, we know substantially less about the Order of the Green Feather. This order has been fairly consistently described as an order of knights, dedicated to the Peacock Spirit, and they were regularly stationed at temples or shrines to the Peacock Spirit, and at facilities managed by the Thoracic Order. Interestingly, they also appeared to have been at least partially incorporated into Cyrusian's formal military, based on the accounts of the Thassilon Aslant War of -6301. Where the Thoracic Order appealed to monks and wizards, I suspect the Order of the Green Feather appealed more strongly to fighters, champions, and battle herald or war priest clerics. Beyond these broad strokes, however, we don't really have much to go on. We do know that multiple legions of Green Feather Knights were casually and collaterally slaughtered by the Oliphant of Jondelay in the Thassilon Aslant War of -6301, but that's about it. Here's hoping we get more information on them in the future. As the faith of the Peacock Spirit spread, Xanderghul proved to be its most prominent advocate. In addition to founding the orders I discussed a moment ago, he even commissioned the construction of a formal home for the new faith, an enormous cathedral complex tucked away in the Koror Mountains, which he dubbed the Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit. This immense facility was hidden from the outside world, cloaked in some of Xanderghul's most powerful illusions, as well as a screen spell to prevent scrying. The location of the site was known only to the faithful, and annual pilgrimages were an expected demonstration of devotion among the followers of the cult. Of course, due to the religion's broad appeal, Xanderghul was not the only Runelord to contribute to the Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit. He convinced most of his fellow Runelords to contribute labor, materials, and wealth to the project. Most of the Runelords saw this as an opportunity to win a PR victory among their citizenry, though at least a few took this as a chance to attempt to upstage Xanderghul within the borders of his own nation. An example of the former might be Runelord Califesta, the first Runelord of Gluttony, who donated a pair of enchanted tables and a matching enchanted cabinet, which produced enough magic-imbued food to feed and even heal up to 15 guests each, intended to serve some of the staff. An example of the latter might be Tanaris, the second Runelord of Envy, who sought to outshine the gardens of Xanderghul's temple by donating an elegantly carved marble fountain. Tanaris had intended for the fountain to serve as the focal point for the gardens at the Grand Temple, becoming the primary exterior shrine for meditation and prayer. Xanderghul, however, wasn't above a little pettiness, and he took care to place the fountain carefully within the complex, so those who sought it out would find themselves with a magnificent view of the temple itself and the surrounding lake, and would therefore think little of the fountain, regardless of its grandeur. Xanderghul even placed a curse upon the fountain, causing all who knelt before it for worship to be turned temporarily invisible. This was a deliberate slight toward Tanaris, whose envious nature couldn't stand the idea of being overlooked, or feeling metaphorically invisible. If you'll pardon a little more candor on my part, Xanderghul may have been the most powerful illusionist of all time, but man was he a petty asshole. The Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit was completed in -6401, only 47 years after Xanderghul discovered the Peacock Spirit and revealed it to the world. As Xanderghul expected, it became the center of worship for the entire cult, drawing worshippers and pilgrims from all across the empire. In addition to its illusory protections, Xanderghul and the leaders of the faith covered the whole facility in a powerful dimensional lock spell, preventing teleportation in or out. Interestingly, however, the highest members of the faith, including Xanderghul himself, were rumored to have a method of bypassing this defense. This was the legendary Viridian Transcendence Ritual, but I'll detail that when I discuss the many works of Xanderghul. While I don't want to get too far into the weeds, the Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit was such an important structure to Xanderghul's story that I feel I wouldn't be doing him justice if I didn't at least provide you with an overview of its layout and features. For a more in-depth look at the locale, I suggest reading Book 4 of the Return of the Runelords AP. The Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit was located in a deep valley with sheer rock walls. Though located at an altitude well above the tree line, the climate in the valley was always comfortable, sustained by magic so trees and gardens could flourish and pilgrims would always feel welcome. This complex consisted of a single large cathedral in the middle of a lake, with beautiful gardens filling much of the surrounding grounds. Several outbuildings also supported the primary facility, including a highly defensible guardhouse. From a design standpoint, the decor of the temple was largely themed around the 7 colors produced by spells like Prismatic Ray and Prismatic Wall. Xanderghul held a fascination with these spells, despite the fact that they weren't actually illusions. These spells were actually what inspired him to begin the tradition of associating specific colors with the 7 schools of magic. Yeah, that color association I've been bringing up near the end of every Sin video was actually started by Xanderghul. Within the temple complex, entire areas were themed around a specific color and sin. Items donated by specific Runelords were typically, though not always, placed in these color-coded sections. No expense was spared in the design of the facility, and only the finest materials and craftsmanship were deemed worthy of the structure. The centerpiece of the temple was the Peacock's Pulpit, a cathedral of relatively small scale, but which was built with a level of magnificence and beauty which made it nearly unparalleled in the field of Thassilonian architecture. The interior of this building was a creation of arcane beauty, a richly detailed illusion maintained by the temple's high priest. Within the structure, the ceiling was replaced with the image of an open sky, and illusory birds of all types and colors swooped and twirled with incredible grace. The walls were painted with a peacock feather motif, and seemed to extend impossibly high until they faded into the sky itself. Benches arranged throughout the room faced a towering purple stone pillar, atop which was perched an immaculately rendered statue of a peacock. The rear wall of the building was also coated in an illusion, which presented the image of a lone spire which pierced the heavens with a single door set into its base. This door marked the entrance to the high priest's chambers. Outside of the main worship space, the cathedral also contained a small but well-stocked library, as well as sleeping and dining quarters for a retinue of priests. What few worshippers realized was that Xanderghul had also constructed several secret facilities beneath the cathedral. One of these, called the Dungeon of Fiery Fury, served as a location for the containment and punishment of the church's enemies. Another, the Vault of Crimson Longing, served as a secret site where Xanderghul could train and condition his giant servants. And, beneath all of these, was the Refuge of Violet Vanity, the final bolt hole to which Xanderghul could escape in the moment of true desperation. More on that near the end of this video. In addition to everything I've described so far, the Grand Temple also contained one more feature of note: a series of unique magical defenses intended to empower the priests and followers of the Peacock Spirit. These were the Peacock Shrines, a series of magical statues which provided passive benefits to all the inhabitants of the temple. The magic-infusing statues could differentiate between those who served as official priests and those who were visitors to the complex, and visitors received no benefits from the magical effects the statues provided. While each Peacock Shrine provided a unique ability, each of these abilities was extremely powerful. Some of these include Fast Healing 10, Resistance 10 to physical damage, Resistance 30 to all forms of energy damage, Immunity to poison, Spell resistance, and immunity to mental effects. Some of these statues provided their effects throughout the entire temple complex, while others were limited to specific geographic areas. These effects could not be suppressed unless the shrines were magically deactivated through the removal of an activation rod, but these rods were each imbued with a powerful curse. Escalation between the Runelords. The arcane arms race, which I described earlier, which had been held primarily between Cyrusian and Xanderghul up to this point in history, expanded in or just before -6360 AR, with the creation of the Sword of Envy by Runelord Tanaris. This weapon proved an incredible asset to the Runelords of Envy, and it didn't take long for the other Runelords to recognize the importance in creating their own Alara High. Cyrusian forged her own Sword of Lust in -6347 in the Runeforge, and Xanderghul, not to be outdone, followed her lead 3 years later. In -6344 AR, illusionists working at the Runeforge, under the direction of Runelord Xanderghul, produced a work of truly impressive craftsmanship. The sword, which would eventually take up the name Barakat, took the form of a simple basket-hilted rapier with a crystalline guard. The weapon appeared incomplete, however, as the blade itself was entirely invisible. The craftsmen presented their work to Xanderghul, who looked upon the sword with approval. Of course, his pride got the better of him, and at first he insisted that none but he were truly worthy of wielding such a weapon. His efforts to prove this point began simply. He trained, for weeks upon weeks, attempting to prove himself a master fencer. When this training only proved the limitations of his own skill, he changed tactics and attempted to imbue the sword with powerful magic, which could bless its wielder with the inherent skill of a master. These efforts, too, failed. As a last-ditch effort, the Lord of Pride attempted the creation of a specialized simulacrum, one which reflected his own personality and will, but which was better suited to swordplay. Even in this, however, Xanderghul was met with failure. Finally, he relented, and came to the conclusion that the sword would better serve him in the hands of someone more martially gifted, a master who had been trained in swordsmanship for centuries. To that end, Xanderghul called from Elysium a specific Gale Azada, a princess of their race called Barakat. Ever cunning and cruel, Xanderghul set to work romancing and entrancing the Azada princess, ensnaring her in a complex and overlapping veil of illusions. As the years passed, Barakat became so immersed in this false reality that she eventually accepted Xanderghul as her master, and willingly took up the Sword of Sin in his service. She would wield the blade for over a century, until she was killed by servants of the Imperial Lord Chidali, who were trying to free her from her twisted imprisonment. So enraptured was Barakat, however, that her mind became infused into the sword upon her death, bestowing the blade with her name for all time. Mechanically, Baraket is a +5 spell-storing speed rapier, which grants an item bonus on bluff checks to feint due to the invisible nature of the blade. On a critical hit, the sword is even capable of casting Weird, now called Phantasmagoria, on a target, though the save DC is not specified. Even among the Swords of Sin, this is an incredibly powerful ability, especially given how easily the rapier in specific triggered critical hits back in 1E. The crafting of the Swords of Sin wasn't the only area where tensions between the Runelords were increasing. At the intersection of geopolitics and religion, Runelord Zirye of Sloth was about to make a big move for dominance. In -6335, she began the construction of Sech-Navali, a temple to the Peacock Spirit intended to surpass Xanderghul's own Grand Temple in Cyrusian. While the construction was a long, slow process, Sech-Navali was finally completed in -6155. Xanderghul took this as a grave personal insult and responded quickly. He immediately began construction on a new temple, one whose magnificence would be unparalleled on Golarion, and which would, once and for all, settle the argument of who was the champion of the Peacock Spirit. His efforts bore fruit in a shockingly short amount of time. Within 3 years, Xanderghul completed construction on the Castle of the Green Feather, a fortress temple intended to serve as both a house of worship and a home base for the Order of the Green Feather. The castle's primary design feature made it particularly well suited as a military base. It floated through the sky on a cloud, and it could be moved by the wizards who lived within. The castle could travel vast distances, and this mobility allowed for rapid troop movements on the scale of whole military companies. In addition to the obvious offensive and defensive benefits this structure provided, it also served as a floating reminder of Xanderghul's might, and the power he was capable of bringing to bear against his enemies. As a minor side note, I strongly suspect that the Castle of the Green Feather is covered in a truly huge number of illusions. Beyond the known illusory defenses intended to make it invisible on command, I suspect that the cloud, the decor, and many of the extraneous spaces visible from the outside of the castle were all permanent illusions, cast by either high-ranking members of the Thoracic Order or Xanderghul himself. My main piece of evidence for this claim is the timeline of the castle's construction. 3 years would have been a short turnaround time on a traditional castle, let alone one built on a chunk of rock intended to float into the air. If I had to guess, or if I ever had to run a homebrew version of this castle as a dungeon, I would say that Xanderghul likely figured out the magic necessary to semi-permanently raise a stone into the air, then built a very basic barracks on a large rock and lifted it into the sky. After that, the illusions necessary to sell the lie would have been a simple matter. Getting back on track, the Cold War between the Runelords finally risked going hot in -6150 AR, with the death of Zirye at the hands of Angathane beneath Kaer Maga. While I sincerely doubt that Xanderghul especially cared about Zirye's death, he was certainly smart enough to recognize that an all-out civil war would only hurt his interest. I'll get into Xanderghul's broader geopolitical strategy in a bit, but in short, he benefited greatly from the peacetime status quo. As such, he decided to take direct action. He personally killed Angathane, making a statement to all the other Runelords that actions like his, the unmasked murder of a fellow Runelord, would not be tolerated. To further emphasize his point, and to clarify that the rule did not apply to Xanderghul himself, he then murdered Jura of Envy and Aferend of Gluttony, whom he apparently saw as the most aggressive of the remaining Runelords. This triple murder, though brutal, accomplished Xanderghul's goal. War was, at least for the time, averted. And Xanderghul, the only person in all of history to kill not 1 but 3 Runelords, was acknowledged by all of Thassilon as the strongest archwizard in the Empire. The Reveal. Now, astute viewers might be noticing a few contrivances, conveniences, or otherwise odd actions taken throughout Xanderghul's story. Where, exactly, was Xanderghul's arcane power coming from? Xanderghul was an incredibly accomplished mage, but what specifically was setting him apart from Cyrusian, the other Runelord who attained mythic status? How and where did he discover the Peacock Spirit? And why would such a narcissistic maniac devote his life and faith to some deity or cause outside of his own glory? Isn't it weirdly convenient that the Peacock Spirit has the Lucerne Hammer, a hyper-specific and uncommon weapon, as its favored weapon? And why does the Peacock Spirit have the Trickery domain? In truth, the Faith of the Peacock Spirit represents possibly the greatest trick Xanderghul ever pulled. An act of sleight of hand which makes even Razmir look small by comparison. You see, Xanderghul was not the one to discover the Peacock Spirit. Xanderghul was the Peacock Spirit. I should explain. After achieving mythic status, Xanderghul felt a stirring of even more power within himself. Grabbing hold of this sliver of power, Xanderghul pushed himself even further and discovered something incredible. This sliver was nothing less than a spark of divinity. Back in 1E, one of the abilities available to mythic characters of at least 3rd tier was Divine Source, the ability to become a lesser divinity and grant spells to divine casters like clerics or paladins. This allowed the character to take up 2 domains, or a 3rd one if the ability was chosen again, as was the case with Xanderghul. As cool as this ability is, it was definitely more flavorful than mechanically impactful, as PCs would have limited ability to make use of low-level divine followers in Wrath of the Righteous, unless the GM was willing to go way off script or simply run a homebrew campaign. In the case of Xanderghul, however, he saw his ascension to divinity on a much longer timescale than a single campaign, and thus recognized it as a unique opportunity. He created a second identity for his deific self and named it the Peacock Spirit, then developed teachings and dogma which supported his own personal ideals, but also had mass appeal. He then revealed this faith to the world, declaring the Peacock Spirit to be a deity which he had merely discovered. This truth explains a great deal of the contradictions I mentioned a minute ago. Of course Xanderghul would choose his own weapon of choice as his official favored weapon. And of course, he would have the Trickery domain. How could he not? In championing the faith of the Peacock Spirit, Xanderghul wasn't contradicting his narcissistic tendencies at all. If anything, he was playing into them in the most on-the-nose way possible, literally worshipping himself as a god and encouraging others to do so. The most insidious part of this whole state of affairs was the power Xanderghul was able to draw from followers he eventually attracted. He took great care in the development of the various rituals of his faith and the construction of the Grand Temple. Pilgrims who visited the temple and conducted the religious rites practiced within were, unbeknownst to them, siphoning off a small sliver of their souls. These slivers, and the energy they contained, were gathered by the magic of the temple, then channeled into either powering the magical functions of the temple itself, or directly into Xanderghul. A not insignificant portion of his power was stolen from the thousands of devout followers he'd managed to attract. And this was what gave Xanderghul the edge over his fellow Runelords. The Rule of Xanderghul. Of course, all the power in the world would have mattered little if Xanderghul had proven inept at wielding it. This, however, was very much not the case. Under the Master of Illusion's leadership, Cyrusian became a prosperous nation. The huge number of monuments and wonders which Xanderghul created did far more than just satisfy his own ego. They had the added benefit of establishing his nation as the cultural capital of Thassilon as a whole. After the death of Xin and the abandonment of his capital city, a political power vacuum opened up, and all the Runelords had the opportunity to assert their legitimacy as Xin's true successor. In forging his nation into a glorious kingdom of prosperity, Xanderghul proved the most adept at claiming this legitimacy for himself, and over many years, Xin Cyrusian slowly became the de facto capital of the empire. In conjunction with the nation's diversity of economic resources, the multiple large population centers drew huge numbers of Thassilonians' financial and academic elite. This expanded the already significant cultural gap between Cyrusian and the other nations, further establishing Xanderghul's claims of superiority, which in turn meshed nicely with the consolidation of religious power in the nation, which came about as a result of the establishment of the Faith of the Peacock Spirit. This all demonstrates a grand, long-term strategy on Xanderghul's part to establish himself as the unofficial emperor of Thassilon, by setting his nation up as the cultural, religious, and economic capital of the whole empire. This, then, had the added benefit of placing Xanderghul and his organizations at the center of many trade and communication networks which spiderwebbed across the empire, and he used these networks to cleverly yet subtly spy on and manipulate his enemies. This theory of a long-term strategy for his own supremacy is further supported by the way Xanderghul interacted with his fellow Runelords. While the 7 Runelords were all considered equal on paper, in practical terms, some of them were far more equal than others. With the exception of the schism of -6150, Xanderghul rarely, if ever, involved himself in the squabbles of his fellow Runelords, whom he largely deemed beneath him. He never went to open war with his fellows, and none of the other Runelords ever dared to invade Cyrusian. That being said, though he was loath to admit it, there was one Runelord whom Xanderghul deemed a potential rival. This was, obviously, Cyrusian, the only other Runelord to ascend to mythic status for much of Thassilon's history, and the only other one who maintained control of her nation up until the eve of Earthfall. Xanderghul considered Cyrusian to be the only legitimate threat to his rule, and treated her with extreme caution as a result. Given what I'll be discussing about Cyrusian tomorrow, this was almost certainly a good call. Of course, even Xanderghul, with all his incredible power, wasn't above seeking out powerful allies to cement his rule. The most famous of these was the legendary Fafnir, father of all Lenorms. For those unfamiliar, Fafnir is a level 24 creature who originated from the First World. According to the Lenorm himself, he migrated to the Grungir forest on Golarion after slaying 3 of the eldest, the demigods who rule over the First World. He brought with him an immense treasure hoard, which he would only add to over the centuries, and a huge clutch of eggs, from which would hatch his children, the Lenorms, which would go on to infest the frozen northwest coast of Avestan. Fafnir is unbelievably powerful, and I don't doubt that he was indeed capable of killing a lesser demigod like the eldest. That said, I also see no evidence that this story wasn't at least embellished significantly, especially since Fafnir has been long suspected of having manipulated Ulfin prophecy in the Age of Lost Omens. Xanderghul's alliance with Fafnir hasn't been explored in much detail, but it is known that they traded unspecified favors back and forth with a degree of regularity. I am especially interested to know how their interactions might have played out, given that each of them was a complete egomaniac, who demanded supplication from those who worked with them. I suspect they probably fought when they first met, and then their alliance was built on a mutual grudging respect, but I can't prove that. In addition to Fafnir, Xanderghul employed all manner of incredibly powerful servants. He regularly enslaved dragons, angels, and giants to fill out his armies, which contributed significantly to the defensibility of Cyrusian and its perceived invulnerability. Xanderghul strongly preferred employing illusions, social manipulation, and mental conditioning to ensure the loyalty of his servants, rather than relying on enchantment spells directly. In the case of giants specifically, Xanderghul rarely made use of the rune giant ability to dominate other giants. Though he certainly had access to plenty of rune giants, he preferred to condition his giant servants with loyalty to him personally, rather than his giant lieutenants. This conditioning likely involved manipulation of the teachings of Minderhall, the god of the stone giants. I'll make a brief digression into this faith near the end of this video for clarity. While Xanderghul was obviously capable of performing this conditioning himself, he typically outsourced the work to a loyal retainer. Near the end of his reign, this position was filled by the shadow giant Tuiriaz, who both hunted down new giants for her master and enslaved them to his will. While many of the Runelords of Thassilon employed the use of clockwork soldiers, servants, or guards, Xanderghul mostly chose to pursue a different kind of semi-manufactured workforce. His desire for a more visually striking solution than his peers led to him making use of a type of construct called a soul-bound shell. These evolutions of the soul-bound mannequin construct were typically carved statues of marble, imbued with the soul of a sacrificed mortal spellcaster, which was housed within a gemstone in the chest. Xanderghul found these servants to be particularly appealing, especially when he had them constructed in his own likeness. Finally, much like Xin before him, Xanderghul also made use of the Shining Children, though he employed them more frequently as guardians of valuable locations, or as primary sources from which he and his scholars could derive arcane and eldritch knowledge. As far as I could find, he never turned them into glorified lamps. The Other Works of Xanderghul. With his own brilliance, his access to rare and ancient sources of information, and the vast resources he could bring to bear through organizations like the Thoracic Order, Xanderghul was an accomplished scholar, researcher, and developer of magic spells and items. I've already touched on the Rune of the Inscrutable One in my discussion of Kroon, but several other items, spells, and abilities can be reliably attributed to Xanderghul and his followers. The empty-hand gloves are one example. These well-made but otherwise inconspicuous gloves contained illusion magic, which allowed the wearer to turn one object held in their hands invisible for up to 3 minutes per day. While it was obvious that the wearer was holding something, this effect still gave the wearer a bonus to attacks and feint checks with a held weapon, though effects or spells like see invisibility rendered the gloves functionally useless. A more powerful item developed under Xanderghul was the Mantle of Lordly Command. This article of clothing was set with gemstones whose appearance changed and shifted. The mantle altered the wearer's appearance, making them always appear clean, uninjured, and well-groomed. Additionally, the item imbued the user with the ability to replicate the effects of a shout spell once per day with a single word. This could even replicate the effects of a 1E command spell, making the item a good representation of Xanderghul's own sense of self-importance. The same might be said for the Raiment of Command spell, a second-rank effect developed by Xanderghul. It cloaked the caster in an illusory disguise, which granted the caster the appearance of an authority figure. The caster had some measure of control over the type of authority figure, and could even use the spell to imitate specific authority figures or specific positions of rank. In addition to the expected benefit of hiding the caster's identity, the spell provided bonuses on social checks, and imposed penalties on the checks of those who interacted with the caster, due to their induced reverence for authority. Like the other Runelords, Xanderghul tried his hand at the creation or magical refinement of living creatures. These efforts were best represented by the Peacock Phoenix, a thunderbird infused with the innate energies of the elemental plane of fire, and which takes on the appearance of a peacock made of multicolored flames. As a level 13 creature, the Peacock Phoenix was fairly powerful, and could unleash lightning bolt and fire breath attacks, in addition to its fire-infused melee claw strikes. These were some of Xanderghul's favorite mid to high-level servants. Probably the most impressive of Xanderghul's magic accomplishments, however, not counting becoming a god at least, was his development of the Viridian Transcendence ritual. As a runic illusionist, Xanderghul was forbidden from casting spells of the Conjuration School, which critically denied him access to teleportation magic. The most obvious ways around this, Wish and Limited Wish, were far too expensive to be applied practically, so Xanderghul set himself to the task of developing a workaround. After his ascension to divinity, he revealed to his faithful his eventual solution, the Viridian Transcendence ritual. This mysterious performance would eventually become one of the cult's most treasured secrets. The ritual granted both the primary caster and the secondary casters access to one of two teleportation effects. The first effect, simply referred to as temple travel, immediately transported the casters to a predetermined location within the grounds of the Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit. The second effect, typically called the Viridian Escape, allowed the casters to imbue themselves with a store of teleportation magic, which could be triggered in an emergency to teleport the caster back to the site of the casting of the ritual. This secondary effect could only be used once by any one caster, meaning they could never use it again, even if they performed the ritual a second time. If the ritual were performed incorrectly, the teleportation effect would still kick in automatically, but would instantly transport the casters to a heavily guarded area of the Temple of the Peacock Spirit, where they could be attacked or interrogated by the temple's defenders, and captured with relative ease. I haven't been able to find any explanations detailing the underlying mechanics of this effect. I also don't know why Xanderghul was able to teleport in this manner, but not others, except for the obvious explanation that this simply isn't an arcane spell, and that he therefore was not forbidden from performing the ritual. I suspect that the ritual makes use of a combination of Xanderghul's arcane power as an archwizard and his divine power as a deity, allowing him to bypass his normal limitations. This is just a guess on my part, however, and it just as easily could be taking advantage of the properties of shadow magic to replicate an effect similar to Shadow Walk. The Viridian Transcendence was quite the spectacle as far as rituals go. To begin, the primary caster needed to inscribe the holy symbol of the Peacock Spirit, a feather containing an eye, on the floor. Then they began to enthusiastically praise the Peacock Spirit, typically through the use of song, dance, or chanting. The secondary casters, who were arranged in a circle about the primary caster and holding hands, were allowed, but not required, to join in this praise, though their contributions needed to be perfectly synced and harmonized with the primary caster. This synchronization was key, as there was a degree of subjectivity to the performance of the ritual. The technical aspects of the ritual were only one part of the equation, and the skill and enthusiasm with which the praises were performed were just as important. These performative aspects needed to be sufficiently entertaining, though how Xanderghul, or whatever powered the ritual, judged what was entertaining is anyone's guess. For this reason, skilled performers of the rituals needed to use the perform skill in conjunction with the arcana, occultism, and religion skills to guarantee their success. Upon the completion of the ritual, teal energy would surround the casters, and the primary caster would then choose to either activate the temple travel effect or imbue the secondary casters with the power of the Viridian Escape. While the Viridian Transcendence ritual was widely used by the cultists of the Peacock Spirit and the scholars of the Thoracic Order, even they did not understand the ritual to its core. Xanderghul kept the deepest secrets of the ritual to himself, and had mastered variations on the effect which could teleport him to other predetermined locations, and with substantially greater frequency than once per lifetime. But this was not the only secret magical technique which Xanderghul held in his back pocket. While Xanderghul was arrogant beyond belief, and his hubris often blinded him to his own faults and weaknesses, he was not so foolish as to believe himself entirely impervious to defeat. He recognized that, even with his spark of divinity, his mortal form could still be killed. As the ultimate backup contingency plan, Xanderghul devised a powerful ritual, one which would activate automatically upon his death and restore him to life. This ritual took advantage of the slivers of souls, which Xanderghul had been able to siphon off from the pilgrims of the Peacock Spirit over the many centuries of his faith's existence. These soul slivers provided an impressive power source to fuel Xanderghul's magic and bind his soul to a new body. To create this body, Xanderghul took advantage of the unique properties of shadow magic, which infused illusion spells with the twisted energies of the netherworld to create illusions which were exceptionally realistic. The ritual gathered shadow energy and formed it into an illusory body, which, thanks to Xanderghul's unrivaled mastery over illusions, was sufficiently real to serve as a new receptacle for his soul. This new body would take shape in the Refuge of Violet Vanity, Xanderghul's most secret and secure sanctum beneath the Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit. He had constructed this space for the purpose of conducting the ritual, and every detail of the facility's construction had been painstakingly calculated to ensure the ritual's success. Xanderghul even placed within the refuge a last form of defense, the most powerful of the Peacock Shrines, which defended the Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit. This shrine bound Xanderghul's soul and the magic which sustained him. If the Archwizard were killed in his shadow body, and this shrine were still active, the shadow body ritual would simply trigger again, restoring Xanderghul to yet another new body. In all his time on the throne of Cyrusian, Xanderghul was never forced to rely on this ritual. He was never killed, and therefore never had to test the magics which he had put in place. That said, he was fairly confident of their eventual success if the worst should happen. He had experimented with the creation of shadow bodies prior to the development of the ritual, and had succeeded in creating several semi-sentient shadow constructs capable of performing all the basic functions of a living being. Some of these were even capable of casting spells. So, Xanderghul felt secure in his contingency plans, even though he'd never been forced to test them. Xanderghul's plan to survive Earthfall. In the years leading up to the Earthfall calamity, Xanderghul sought to attain further glory for himself. During the succession crisis in Aslant, when Eredin was tasked with the creation of the Aslanti Diamond Sword and the eventual choosing of the Emperor, Xanderghul presented himself to the court and put his name forward as the obvious choice for the throne. He cited his unequaled performance as a ruler in Thassilon and his incredible magical accomplishments, in addition to his impeccable noble lineage. Eredin was unmoved by Xanderghul's arguments and saw the tyrannical illusionist for the villain he was. Eredin ultimately refused to choose a successor, and Xanderghul returned to Cyrusian empty-handed. Not long after this, Xanderghul became aware of the oncoming Earthfall calamity. His divinity likely played a role in this discovery, though that's just a guess. While Xanderghul had already crafted his major runewell of pride, he refused to make use of the device to escape into a personal demiplane. The runewells had been originally developed by Cyrusian, and the idea of having to rely on the accomplishment of his most hated rival was completely anathema to Xanderghul's all-consuming pridefulness. In his hubris, he abandoned the most obvious solution to his problems. If I know anything about my classical literature, this could not possibly work out poorly for him. Instead of pursuing a runewell, Xanderghul set his sights on a much more glorious artifact, the legendary Scepter of Ages. Even during the ancient Thassilonian period, legends from time immemorial spoke of mysterious and powerful travelers who displayed abilities related to the manipulation of time. Though these legends could be found all across Golarion, they all shared a specific detail. The traveler always bore a scepter in their hands, and this scepter was always topped with a strange tangle of metal, which scholars would eventually describe as reminiscent of a key. This was the rumored Scepter of Ages, an artifact tied to the little-known dimension of time. Though other Runelords were making their own inroads into the study of time magic, namely Karzug with the Cyphergate and Azutha with the Seraph's Ladder, Xanderghul was about to attempt something far more impressive. He began his search for the Scepter of Ages, intending to transport himself and his armies of loyal servants and soldiers into the future, completely bypassing the Earthfall calamity. This search was not an easy task, even for a scholar and wizard as learned and powerful as Xanderghul. Studies on the dimension of time were rare, even at the height of Thassilonian culture, and beings from that dimension could not be reliably encountered or questioned. Xanderghul eventually discovered a single important text relating to the dimension of time: the Book of Serpents, Ash, and Acorns, Shadows of What Was and What Will Be. This is the same text I mentioned in my video on gluttony. This tome supposedly holds some degree of sentience, though the degree to which it can interact with the reader is unclear, at least beyond imparting vague impressions. The book was originally penned by the scholar Empedocles, a real-world philosopher from Earth who was active in Sicily prior to the time of Socrates. On Earth, Empedocles is best remembered for his theories concerning the 4 classical elements: water, earth, fire, and air. In the Paizoverse, these theories were ultimately correct, and this indicated his genius as a planar scholar. Empedocles' death on Earth was surrounded by mystery and legend, though the Paizo canon makes it clear that he vanished after hurling himself into a volcano and was transported to the dimension of time. He recorded his observations on the dimension of time into the Book of Serpents, Ash, and Acorns, then hurled it into the multiverse. The text contained more than enough information to locate the Scepter of Ages, assuming it could be deciphered. Unfortunately for Xanderghul, he, ironically, ran out of time. He failed to locate the Scepter of Ages in time to save himself and his nation from destruction. That said, the search had not been a total loss. He'd learned enough in his studies to create his own time-isolated demiplane, through the application of his mythic and deific power. On the eve of Earthfall, he retreated into this sanctum, resolving to take up the hard work of re-establishing his nation and faith upon his eventual return to Golarion. Though far from ideal, this solution would at least preserve his own life. And of course, Xanderghul's pride reared its ugly head again, and he refused to rely on any form of outside help to wake him from his isolation. He developed an automated magical timer, effectively an arcane alarm clock, which was scheduled to release the Lord of Pride from his demiplane after precisely 100 years. This was the time period which Xanderghul had calculated would be needed to evade the worst of the danger. And so, when the Earthfall meteor came crashing down upon Golarion, Xanderghul fled into his demiplane, temporarily cutting off his divine power from his followers, but ultimately guaranteeing his survival. The Thoracic Order, the Order of the Green Feather, and the Cult of the Peacock Spirit were all left to fend for themselves in the oncoming Age of Darkness. Of course, we know that Xanderghul isn't in power in the Age of Lost Omens, so something must have gone horribly wrong. Don't worry, we'll get there. The Faith of Minderhall. If you'll allow me one more brief digression, there is one more aspect of Thassilonian culture which I haven't yet discussed. With all the talk of religion in this video, I thought it appropriate to discuss one more faith which played a significant role in the culture of ancient Thassilon as a whole. In addition to direct control through the rune giants and coercive control via the threat of inversion, the Runelords also manipulated their giant workforce through the power of religion. While many deities were worshipped by the Runelords and their apprentices, Minderhall, the ancestral god of the stone giants, was reserved for the laboring class, and especially the giants. Minderhall was a pragmatic and strict deity who encouraged his followers to adhere to hierarchy and tradition. Witnessing the rise of Thassilon, Minderhall instructed his followers to submit themselves willingly to the Runelords, believing, correctly, that the giants might be able to spread their faith to the other races in the laboring underclass within the empire. Though the giants, and especially the stone giants, found this demeaning, they did as commanded. The Faith of Minderhall was well suited for the laboring classes of Thassilon, as it slotted into their daily lives easily, and soon became one of the most prominent faiths in the empire, alongside the Faith of Desna. It was always relegated to the lower classes, however, and the Thassilonian elites looked down upon it as a religion for slaves. The Faith of Minderhall slowly rose to prominence among all manner of giants in Thassilon, spreading far beyond the stone giant tribes from which it had originated. In reverence for their patron god, the giants of Thassilon constructed an immense forge temple in the Iron Peaks of Shalast. Located on the shores of the modern Storval Deep, the temple was constructed at an incredible scale, intended to welcome giants of all statures. Called Minderhall's Anvil, the building took the shape of an immense anvil made of stone, and the enormous sanctuary inside was decorated with a statue of the god himself, overlooking the valley to the east, his head resting contemplatively on his closed fist. Marble pillars of impossible size supported a soaring ceiling within, and halls and passages of varying size descended into the building's depths, where crypts held the honored dead among giant kind. After the eventual collapse of Thassilon, the Faith of Minderhall went through its own internal collapse among the giants. Many of the giants, who now found themselves free of their cruel archwizard masters, abandoned the god, whose teachings had led them into lives of bondage. The stone giants, in particular, largely abandoned any form of deific reverence, and instead returned to their cultural roots, revering the wisdom of their elders and worshipping the spirits of their deceased ancestors. They also developed a strong cultural hatred for all forms of wizardry, remembering the powerful spellcasters who had bound them in chains for generations. For players looking to build characters devoted to the sin of pride, the virtue of humility, or the school of illusion more broadly, here are some ideas. Common personal edicts among practitioners of pride might include to hold yourself to a high standard, to force others to acknowledge your accomplishments, and to attain a position of authority worthy of your greatness. Conversely, common personal edicts among practitioners of humility might include to celebrate the achievements of others, to accept praise with gratitude and only when it is truly earned, and to accept your limitations and weaknesses. For those using the alignment rules, humble characters will tend toward good alignments, while prideful characters will tend toward evil. As a minor point of clarification, Paizo interprets the word pride in this context to mean the opposite of humility, as opposed to the opposite of shame. There is a meaningful difference between these definitions. Characters who are righteously proud of the success of themselves and their allies in the face of severe challenges, or characters who are living as their truest selves despite the judgment of others, are not necessarily engaging in the classic Thassilonian sin of pride. For characters who wield weapons in combat, the Lucerne hammer and the rapier have a strong connection to the School of Illusion, since they were the base weapons for the Alara Keen and Alara High of Pride. Since the Lucerne hammer doesn't exist in Pathfinder 2e, I suggest using either the Bec de Corbin or the Dwarven Longhammer as stand-ins. Other weapons classically associated with rulership, like the longsword, might bear a connection to the sin of pride, while the flickering and unexceptional property runes might demonstrate a connection to illusion magic, as might any weapon well suited to feinting, like the duelist's buckler or any weapon with an eye catcher attached. Characters emphasizing their connection to illusion might drape themselves in violet fabrics, a color which in Thassilon represented both pride and humility. I suspect on a meta level, violet was chosen as the color of pride due to its association with royalty in European history. Rainbow patterns, or other bold multicolored ensembles, were also commonly associated with both illusion and pride. Xanderghul himself was an example of this, as he was most commonly depicted not in purple, but in the blues and greens of a peacock's tail feathers. Peacock imagery was common throughout ancient Cyrusian and might still hold some connection to illusion, though the faith of the Peacock Spirit has been functionally dead for almost 10,000 years. More than any other school, characters associated with illusion should consider embracing a constantly evolving appearance, using illusion spells in conjunction with magic items and mundane methods of disguise to change their appearance as necessary, based on whatever situation they find themselves facing. The most obvious deity to mention when discussing religions with a connection to illusion is, of course, the Peacock Spirit. But I've talked about that enough in this video, and the faith is functionally dead on Golarion. Instead, Sivana might be an excellent choice for most illusionists, though her edicts tend to skew a little bit toward the good end of the morality spectrum. On the more explicitly benevolent side, deities like Chaldira Zuraristan or Nivi Rambadazzle might encourage their followers to use illusions either to bring down tyrants or defend their communities. On the more explicitly evil side, Mahathala, the Dowager of Illusions, might encourage her followers to exploit others by using illusory powers and deception. And, for exceptionally chaotic or mischievous characters, deities like Grandmother Spider or Callistria might hold a certain appeal. There's also a parallel I should mention between the three aspects of the self espoused by the Peacock Spirit and the same three aspects which are endorsed by Irori. Dejected cultists of the Peacock Spirit might eventually turn to the faith of Irori in the absence of their god, and thus might find a renewed purpose. Looking at the classes available to PCs, a few stand out as exceptionally tied to illusion. Illusionist wizards are likely best represented post-remaster by the School of Mentalism, though that school is also connected pretty strongly to enchantment. That said, the convincing illusion feat should give any wizard a connection to illusion magic. Sorcerers of the Elemental Genie bloodline gain access to a large number of illusion spells, and might be infused with a degree of their ancestors' prideful nature. Probably the best non-wizard illusionist, however, is the Tangible Dream Psychic, who gains access to spells and cantrips like Figment, Hologram Cage, Mirror Image, and Confusing Colors. And of course, the Shadowcaster archetype could bring a degree of illusory power to any caster. For characters with familiars, animals which can change color, like chameleons, are seen as having some connection to illusion. The same can also be said of peacocks, for reasons which should be obvious by this point in the video. Even martial characters can take advantage of illusion magic in some fun and creative ways. An inventor from Varissia, or the lands of the Lenorm kings, might incorporate ancient Cyrusian magitech into their armor innovation to gain the camouflage pigmentation innovation. Monks, using the Clinging Shadows stance, might interpret their powers as an extension of the shadow magic often employed by illusionists. Really though, the martial which stands out the most in this regard is the Mirror Implement Thaumaturge, who can create an illusory duplicate of themselves at will. Circling back to the idea I've been toying with throughout these videos, I actually think it would be hilarious to have a Mirror Thaumaturge with a high deception skill and the Scroll Esoterica line of feats make a play for the title of Runelord of Pride. What greater illusion could there be than convincing the whole world that you're a wizard? The ancestry with the strongest connection to the powers of illusion is probably the Fetchlings, with their connection to the plane of shadow. While not many of their powers are technically illusions, they could easily be reflavored as such. Humans were the dominant ancestry in Cyrusian, though the prominence of angels and dragons throughout the nation might have led to an overrepresentation of celestial Nephilim or dragon-blooded humans among their descendants. Among the Varissian peoples, the Harrow cards, the Carnival, and the Demon's Lanterns were often seen as having some connection to illusion. The planet Liavara, with its many colorful rings, has long been accepted by astrologers as being symbolic of illusion. For GMs looking to incorporate the School of Illusion, the Runelord of Pride, the Faith of the Peacock Spirit, or the Nation of Cyrusian into a campaign, here are a few more ideas. The Castle of the Green Feather, once so grand, has long been absent from the skies over Varissia. The magic sustaining its levitation gave out some time after the Earthfall calamity, and the whole structure crashed somewhere in the Kodor Mountains. It has yet to be rediscovered in the Age of Lost Omens. The many knights and wizards within are likely still active as liches and grave knights loyal to the Peacock Spirit, and they might present a serious threat to modern Avestan if they ever devise a means of restoring the flight capabilities of their legendary fortress. One fun Thassilonian ruin, which I haven't yet discussed, is the Floating Sphere of Maufrey. This huge floating sphere of stone is covered in the heavily weathered remnants of Thassilonian runes. The artifact drifts in a lethargic 600-mile circle around the Kerchain Hills, well within Cyrusian's long-forgotten borders. The exact dimensions of the artifact are unclear, but it is partially hollowed out, and is large enough to have served as a nesting ground for drakes and giant spiders over the years. Tribes of goblins and their cousin races have also historically used the structure as a mobile camp, reaching it by leaping off the cliffs which the artifact passes on its leisurely migration. This artifact presents a fantastic opportunity for GMs to introduce Thassilonian influence into a campaign without diving too deeply into the quagmire that is Thassilonian lore. The sphere could serve as an early dungeon for players to explore, which has a fun gimmick. Players without access to flight will only have specific times and locations where they can get on or off the object without risking significant injury. For larger campaigns, the secrets of the sphere's interior might reveal the locations of Thassilonian treasures throughout northern Varissia. Alternatively, PCs might discover that the sphere can be piloted outside of its normal circular course, granting them access to something akin to a jury-rigged airship. Though the original purpose of this structure has never been revealed by Paizo, my theory is that it was an early prototype for the Castle of the Green Feather. One set of Cyrusian-based ruins, which are decidedly more sinister, are the Drill Stones. Located in the northern foothills of the Kodor Mountains, the Drill Stones are a series of 36 60-foot-tall tapered stone pillars, marked by a distinctive spiraling groove. This groove, coupled with the conical shape of the pillars, has led some to theorize that these stones were once the heads of some ancient drill-like device, intended for some bizarre military project. This theory is partially supported by the tendency of the stones to vibrate and hum at high frequencies. Caverns beneath the drill stones were discovered in the Age of Lost Omens, and these contained the remnants of ancient clockwork constructs. As for what enemies Xanderghul might have had which necessitated the creation of a huge drill-equipped weapon, well, the Serpent Folk, once the rivals to the Aslanti humans, still maintained a grip on power in a few secret redoubts across Golarion. One of these locations was the Mobat Ley, a cavern system leading into the Darklands. Though the Serpent Folk had been on the decline since the death of their patron deity Iderzius, they still proved irritating to the Runelords, and conflicts between the two civilizations weren't unheard of. One final site to discuss is Moonwing's Bow, an ancient shrine to Desna hidden deep within the Grungir forest. Though surrounded by the dangers and corruption of Fafnir's Grungir forest, the grove of trees which surrounds the shrine is a place of peace, safety, and tranquility. The site was named for Moonwing, the priest of Desna who rediscovered the site after the Age of Darkness. Though the Church of Desna discourages all but the most powerful followers from attempting the dangerous journey to the site, pilgrims who do manage to reach it are blessed with a powerful divine boon from their goddess. Some reports even claim that these boons rival the effect of a miracle spell. These blessings have even been granted to followers of Desna's allied deities, like Sarenrae or Shelyn. My, admittedly, crackpot theory. Alright, before I go into this, I need to issue an extra spoiler warning. I'm about to break my rule for this series and discuss the events of the Return of the Runelords adventure path. Major spoilers. Also, very minor spoilers for a single line from the end of Stolen Fate. This is your final warning. Stop the video now or forever hold your peace. So, in the Age of Lost Omens, Xanderghul is well and truly dead. He was first killed by a Lasnist, who essentially spawn-camped him as he woke from isolation in his demiplane. This triggered the Shadow Resurrection ability I discussed earlier, restoring him to life at the Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit. He was then killed permanently by the heroes of the Return of the Runelords AP. Now, I say permanently, but there's a line at the end of Stolen Fate which signals pretty clearly, at least to me, that Xanderghul's death was temporary at best. In Stolen Fate, the PCs receive a series of visions showing several images of the past, present, and future. Why is this relevant? Well, one of those images is a crowned phoenix with the tail of a peacock. Peacocks in Pathfinder, especially in APs tied to Varissian culture like Stolen Fate, are universally a representation of Xanderghul, and phoenixes are, of course, famous for their ability to resurrect upon death. So, my theory is this. Xanderghul is coming back. With the recent release of the 2E Mythic rules, PCs finally have the tools necessary to fight the biggest and baddest of the Runelords at his full power, an opportunity which was stolen from us in 1E. I suspect that when this finally happens, it will be the culmination of the next major chapter in the story of the Runelords, the fourth AP in the Runelords series, so to speak. I expect this future AP will be Paizo's first exploration of New Thassilon, and will heavily feature Sortian, Belimarius, the Faith of Nocticula, and the lost legacies of Zin and his wayward apprentices. Alright, that's enough speculation. This marks the end of my discussion of the Runelords of Pride, and the School of Illusion Magic. Ugh, this script was not supposed to be this long. I'm glad I stuck with this one and didn't cut it short, because Xanderghul as a character is definitely worth all the attention, but still, I'm getting worn out. I am so close to the end of this series, I can almost taste it. I can't believe I'm saying this, but tomorrow is the last of the 7 sins I need to discuss. Up next is Lust, the sin of Sortian, the mistress of enchantment. If you've been sticking with this series since the beginning, we're almost there. We'll get through this together, I promise. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.